I started driving for Uber in 2020 when the pandemic was still causing chaos because I needed quick money after being laid off from my retail job. The thing about ride-sharing gigs is that you meet a variety of people, especially when you work late at night like I did. However, that doesn't compare to what happened one Friday night in October when I had just dropped someone off at a hotel near the outskirts of town and my app pings almost immediately with a new request. The pickup location was about 6 minutes away in front of a bowling alley that was part of a strip mall. It was pretty standard stuff. The rider's name was Derek, so I accepted it and headed. I pulled up and he looked at me, but he didn't wave or move. I rolled down the window and said, "You Derek?" He nodded slowly, walked over, and got into the back seat behind me. I started the trip and asked him if the destination in the app was correct, an address about 20 minutes away in a residential neighborhood I'd never been to. He said, "Yeah, that's right." The area was quiet when I arrived, with only a few dim parking lot lights, no cars in sight, and the bowling alley appeared to be closed. I remember thinking that his voice sounded a little strange, not drunk or high, just kind of flat and emotionless, but I didn't give it much thought at the time. I drove for the next 5 or 6 minutes, and every time I looked at him in the rearview mirror, he was staring straight ahead, not out the window or at his phone, just at the back of my head. I tried to break the silence by asking how his night was going, but he paused and said, "Just needed to get out of there." I asked him where he was going and he replied, "Doesn't matter." I didn't press. We continued driving for another 15 minutes or so before realizing that we were getting closer to our destination, but the address was in and I asked, "Is this your place?" And he said, "Just pull in." I hesitated, but I turned into the driveway, stopped close to the front of the house, and put the car in park. He pointed to a house on the right, which was dark, with no lights on inside or out. It had an overgrown lawn, peeling paint on the siding, and no car in the driveway. As we got closer to the address, he abruptly leaned forward and said, "Actually, can you pull into that driveway right there?" He gazed at the front door and said, "Wait here." He then got out and began to walk toward the house, but instead of going to the front door, he went around the side of the building and vanished from view. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes trying to decide what to do because, technically, the ride was still going and I didn't want to drive away and get in trouble, but I also had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. I manually ended the trip, marked it as complete, and began to back out of the driveway, but before I could put the car in reverse, I noticed him quickly approaching the car again, his hands empty, and he had a strange expression on his face like I unlocked the doors because I didn't want to start a fight, but something inside of me was screaming that I shouldn't let him back in. He opened the back door and said, "Take me to the other place." I asked, "Just drive and I'll tell you." I said, "You need to put it in the app." He didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at me in the mirror. I repeated, "I can't take you anywhere unless you put it in the app." After a few seconds, he told me to drive to the location where I picked him up. Since I didn't want to argue anymore, I started walking back toward the strip mall. I tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Rough night." He responded, "You could say that." I asked if everything was okay, and he said, "Not yet." I didn't ask any more questions when we returned to the strip mall, where I parked under the same light where I picked him up, but before I could say anything, he leaned forward and asked, "You ever wonder how you're going to die?" I froze, laughed awkwardly, and said, "Not really something I think." He didn't laugh. Instead, he simply leaned back in his seat and said, "I think about it all the time." He then opened the door and got out without saying anything else. He didn't close the door right away. Instead, he stood there for a minute and a half in and out of the car before he looked at me and said, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." He then closed the door and drove off into the darkness behind the bowling alley. I sat there for a minute, too shaken to move, and then I drove home, constantly checking my mirrors. When I looked at the trip details again, I noticed that something was wrong. The name had changed. It no longer said Derek, it was blank. I called Uber support to report it because it seemed like the ride never happened. They said that sometimes that happens if the app crashes or if the rider cancels halfway, but I know what I saw. I know the man got in and out of my car and he said what he said, "You picked the wrong guy up tonight." I've never seen him again and I hope I never do, but every time I get a ping in a dimly lit parking lot or have a silent passenger in the back seat, I think back to that night and the feeling that something horrible could have happened. Perhaps he changed his mind at the last minute, or perhaps he was just trying to frighten someone. However, I'm still curious about what he meant and whether he ever found the right car. This happened in 2021 when I was working as a full-time Uber driver. I live in a city that receives a lot of tourists, especially during the summer, so ride-sharing jobs can pay well if you're consistent. I worked mostly nights, partly because I'm a night owl and partly because there was less traffic and better tips from inebriated passengers returning from bars. That night, it was around 1:30 in the morning, a fairly typical Saturday night crowd. I had just dropped off a group of college students who wouldn't stop yelling in the back of my car, so I was relieved to receive a request that appeared to be quieter. The name was Chris, and the pickup location was a small side street just off downtown. The strange thing was the pin was I pulled up and said, "Chris," and he nodded and got in the back without saying anything. He didn't smell like alcohol or slur his words, and he seemed sober and just really quiet. He didn't say hello or answer when I asked how his night was going. Some people just aren't talkers, so I didn't think much of it. I started the ride, and the drop-off was on the opposite side of town, 25 minutes away, in a suburban neighborhood I'd been to maybe once or twice before. I noticed that Chris had his phone out about 5 minutes into the trip, but he wasn't texting or calling anyone. He was holding it flat in his lap with the flashlight on, shining the beam upwards slightly toward my seat. I asked him, half jokingly, "Everything all right back there?" He just mumbled, "Yeah," and then turned the flashlight off. The next 20 minutes were completely silent, with only the hum of the engine and a strange tension building in the car. I'm not sure how to describe it, but something felt strange about this guy, not threatening but definitely uneasy, like he wasn't really there. I used the GPS to find the house, but when we arrived, I saw that it was completely dark, no porch light, no interior lights, so I asked, "Is this the right place?" Chris didn't respond. Instead, he just sat there. I turned around and looked at him and I said, "Hey, is this it?" A little louder. He stared past me out the window, so I said it again, and at last he nodded. I put the car in park and said, "Have a good night." He didn't move, so I asked again, "Are you good?" And he reached for the handle and got out, but he didn't close the door. I waited for a few seconds, then 20, and then a full minute before he abruptly turned around and said, "I need to go back." I blinked and asked, "Back where?" His tone was emotionless and flat, and I was at a loss for words. Since it was a 25-minute drive and there was no way for me to reverse the trip, I told him he would have to request a new ride, but he just stared at me and begged me, saying, "Please, I need to go back." I repeated, "You need to request it through the app." "I can't, they're not gone yet," he said, and my only possible response was, "Who's not gone?" He didn't respond. Instead, he just stood there holding the door open, and I could see he was breathing heavily. At that point, I became extremely uncomfortable, so I said, "Look, I can't just start a new ride unless you request it." He stared for a second longer before slowly backing away and closing the door. He then proceeded toward the house, despite the fact that it was dark and appeared deserted. I waited until he reached the porch before pulling off, and the moment I turned the corner, I ended the trip in the app and began driving back toward downtown. A few blocks down, I stopped at a 24-hour gas station to use the restroom and get a drink. I parked at the side of the building, went inside, and came out maybe 4 minutes later. When I got back to my car, I felt as though my brain had short-circuited because Chris was sitting in the back seat, wearing the same hoodie and looking the same. I thought I had locked the doors before entering, but he was in the back. I opened the driver's side door and stepped back in slowly, keeping an eye on him through the mirror. "Take me back," I said. "I'm calling the cops," and reached for my phone. I don't know why, but something about the way he said that made me think he was having some sort of episode. I played along and asked, "Whose house is that?" He replied, "My parents'." I asked him if he lived there, and he replied, "Not anymore." That made the hair stand up on my neck, so I started slowly driving back to where I picked him up. As we got closer, he started breathing more heavily, and at one point, he was rocking slightly in the back seat. "They're still there, they won't leave no matter what I do," he whispered. When we arrived at the house, there were still no lights or signs of anyone living there. He got out without saying anything, then walked up to the front door and stood there without knocking or anything. I waited for maybe 30 seconds before pulling away again, making sure the doors were locked. I drove 3 blocks, parked under a street light, and sat there for 10 minutes, trying to process what had happened. I considered calling the police, but what would I say when a guy got into my car twice and said strange things? There was no crime as far as I knew, so I just drove home that night and didn't sleep the next day. I'm an 18-year-old girl who lives alone in my apartment with my dog. I live about 8 miles out of town, so getting food delivered can be a hassle sometimes. I never thought anything of Uber Eats being bad. You may hear some stories, but never think they will happen to you, at least that's what I thought. It was Friday evening, and I was cleaning my apartment in preparation for my boyfriend to come over. Since we live far away and only get to see each other on the weekends, I usually try to get it cleaned up before he arrives. I regret not reporting this to the police because I hope he didn't hurt anyone. He comes on Saturday after I've been cleaning for about 2 hours and it was past 6 o'clock, so I decided to order some food so I wouldn't have to make a mess. I ordered my food and received a notification that my driver was on his way, driving a white Honda Fit Sport. Since I'm a young girl living alone, I have my delivery instructions set to leave my order at my door for contactless delivery, so I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I received the notification that my food was delivered. I jumped up with excitement to get my food, but when I opened the door to get it, it wasn't there. I thought maybe he set it at the wrong door, but when I looked down at all the doors, none of them had the food, so I went back in and was about to message him when I heard a knock. It was my neighbor from next door, and he was holding my food. He said, "Hey, sorry, I picked up your food from your delivery driver because he was looking through your windows and I wasn't sure what he was doing." I thanked him and took the food, wondering what the hell had happened. I went back in, ate, and watched a movie, but before I went to bed, I took a shower, made sure my TV was off, laid down in bed, called my boyfriend, and eventually fell asleep. I was awakened several times during the night by my dog growling at the window or the back door. My dog isn't a big, scary dog. He's only 5 pounds, but it's still pretty scary when he growls at something and catches you off guard. I eventually got him to calm down and go back to sleep, but not even 15 minutes later, I woke up to a banging on my window. My dog began to go crazy, barking, growling, and even whimpering, making it impossible for me to move in my bed. I took the bed linens and pulled them over my head so that I could see the window. I called the police, whispering into the phone, explaining to the operator that someone was in my backyard and that my window didn't lock, so it was easy to lift it up. She advised me to go to a different room. The police would be at my apartment soon, so I ran to my kitchen and grabbed a knife in anticipation of seeing blue and red lights or hearing sirens. It seemed like forever, but when I opened my kitchen window, I saw the Uber driver's car that had delivered my food. When you open the door to my apartment, there's a big open field to the left that's used for parking trailers and letting dogs play. He was parked there, but I didn't see anyone in the car, so I connected the dots and thought, he's in my backyard. When the police finally arrived, I was sobbing and trembling that I could hardly speak. "Check out my backyard," which is where my bedroom window is. Another officer came to check his car because it was still in the field, but he wasn't in it. The 2 officers returned and began talking to the officer I was speaking to, telling her that there were footprints in my backyard. It had just rained the night before, so it was very muddy outside, so I started to panic when I heard that. Not only was it not what you wanted to hear, but I also wondered where this guy was, because if he didn't return, he would be arrested by the police. My neighbor came outside to see what was happening, and the officers explained the situation to him. He then talked about how he had picked up my food earlier that day, and the neighbor invited me to sleep. Strangely, I declined the offer to spend the night at his apartment if it would make me feel better. After the police officers had all departed, I returned to my apartment, believing everything was finished. It took me a few hours to settle down, but I fell asleep at 2 a.m. When I heard police knocking on my front door and thought, there's no way this is happening right now, I got up and was afraid to open it. It was the woman I had spoken to earlier, and she explained that they had stayed at my apartment hidden to watch for that guy in case he returned. When he did, they caught him approaching my front door, thinking he was going to try to find a way out. Her words made my heart sink. I was 26 at the time, and I'm male. I was in Washington, D.C., on a sort of vacation visiting my then-fiancée, Sarah, for a graduation she was having for her basic training. It was a big deal for her family, so she asked me to be there. I said why not, and I booked the flight so I'd be there about a week before the rest of her family so she and I could have some time, just the 2 of us, before she would be busy having all of her family there for the occasion. I thanked her and tried to go back to sleep, but I couldn't sleep this time. I also don't use Uber Eats anymore when I'm at home alone. Me at my hotel during this time, and eventually we decided we wanted to go and explore some of the nearby historical sites that Washington had to offer. Since I had never been there before, of course, the idea piqued my interest, so we decided to do it. Once we got to our destination, we spent about 4 hours walking around and seeing all the sights, from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument, the Congress Building, and even the White House. It was a really exciting and fun experience for me to see all these places because I had missed a high school field trip to visit them. Sarah at the time seemed to appreciate my interest in them as well, and we had a great time after we finally decided we had had enough walking around and were ready to return to the after using the Uber app to get a ride to the hotel, we decided to use it again for the return trip. Sarah made the request on her phone, and I sat down in some shade and waited. I was exhausted from all the walking we had done, and I could feel my body ready for a long-needed nap. After 10 minutes or so, a car pulled up in front of us along the side of the road, and Sarah pointed to me that this was the car because the spot they stopped at wasn't a parking space or a place a car would just stop at. I got up and followed her to the car after she opened the back door and got inside, asking the man, "Uber for Sarah?" She gave me a small nod without saying anything, so I followed her inside and closed the door. Looking back, I see how foolish we were both for doing this. We should have asked for the driver's name and made sure the car matched the one on the app. Since I didn't have access to any of this at the time and she made the request on her phone, I didn't really think to do any of this. We sat in the back of the gray minivan, and the driver didn't say anything. I thought this was a little strange because any other driver I'd ever had would at least say hello or confirm my name, but this guy began driving without saying anything. He was our Uber driver, and I noticed that it was strange, but I was exhausted and didn't feel like trying to talk to him personally, so I just laid back and closed my eyes. After what seemed like only 5 minutes of the drive, I opened my eyes and looked at Sarah. She didn't say anything, but I could tell that she was worried about something because she pointed to her phone, which showed the route the Uber would take to return us to our hotel. It didn't take me long to realize that the route we were taking was actually the opposite of what the route had stated, and I could see Sarah's face turn pale when a notification appeared on her phone, saying that our Uber had arrived, and then receiving a message from the driver asking where we were made me realize how foolish I had been for not checking the car and driver before we just stepped in. The picture on Sarah's phone in the app did not match the driver, and I knew we had gotten ourselves into a situation. I slowly turned to face the driver, but I said nothing because I had no idea what this man was up to and I honestly didn't want to find out. I just knew that I had to get Sarah and myself out of that car right then, so I leaned forward and told him that we had changed our minds and would be okay just being let out of the situation. My patience had run out, and I knew whatever this man had in store for us wasn't good, so I did the only thing I could think of at the time. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my pocket knife. I flipped the blade out, and without wasting any more time, I told the driver, "I know you're not our Uber driver. I don't know what your plan is here or anything." He looked at me through the rearview mirror in the first actual acknowledgement of us he had given since we got into the car. He looked at me for what seemed like minutes, but was probably only 10 seconds. "What you think you're going to do to us, but I have a knife, and if you don't pull this car over right now, I have no problem using it." The driver glanced at me once more in the rearview mirror, and I knew he could see the knife in my hand. He quickly pulled the van over, and I heard the doors unlock. Sarah and I wasted no time in getting out of the car as quickly as we could, and as soon as we were out, the man sped off. We took a moment to collect ourselves because Sarah was having a panic attack, and I was still trying to comprehend what the hell just happened. Sarah immediately took out her phone, responded to our actual Uber driver, and asked if he could come pick us up. The real driver showed up in a few minutes, and this time we made sure it was the right one. We told him everything that had happened, and then he told us something that made my blood run cold. He told us that there had been several cases recently of people impersonating Uber drivers in the area because it was a simple way to find many tourists and non-locals who wouldn't think twice about just getting into a car thinking it was a Lyft or Uber. Apparently, many people had gone missing, and they could only assume the worst. He told us both that we were fortunate that we noticed when we did and hadn't gotten farther away from where we had been picked up, which was likely the only reason the man let us go. We returned to the hotel without incident, and we promptly reported it to the police. We provided the best description of the man and the car we could, and they promised to contact us with any information they could find. However, we never heard back from them, so I assume the man was never apprehended or found, which worries me because he might still be out there committing this crime to others. I realized how foolish we were both for not checking whose car we were getting into, but let this serve as a reminder to everyone listening. Always double-check your Uber drivers and be mindful of your surroundings.